All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And this is my presentation on my meta-analysis I conducted with my student Shafiq on open textbook adoption. So you probably have all heard that commercial textbooks have become exorbitantly expensive. And in fact, they've increased more than any consumer good, about triple the rate of overall inflation in the United States. This matters because costs have a big role in whether or not students are able to successfully complete their courses. And whether or not students successfully complete their courses also affects the institution as a whole. Because taxpayers are supporting these institutions and students through student loans and various sources of revenue, taxpayers end up shouldering a lot of this. So we're all affected by the cost of textbooks. In fact, as little as $300, which can easily be the price of a new commercial textbook, that can make the difference between whether or not a student can graduate from college. As a response, partly to the rising cost of textbooks and also because of issues with restrictive licensing, open educational resources have been developed. Open educational resources are teaching and learning materials that are available without access fees in the public domain. Open educational resources include a wide variety of materials, including music, videos, interactive modules, but I'm going to be focusing on textbooks, partly because I'm a reading comprehension researcher by training, so textbooks are inherently interesting to me, and also because of the ubiquity of textbooks in college education. You know, around 70% of college courses require a textbook. So a little bit of background on the research that's been conducted on learning efficacy. That is, how well do students do if they're using an open textbook compared to a commercial textbook? Well, there's been a lot of studies that have been conducted on this topic. The findings have been mixed. Some findings showed no difference. The study by Garung that's there showed a negative effect of open textbooks. And other studies, such as the one by Colvard, found a benefit. And when you look at the overall conclusion of qualitative reviews that are descriptive overviews of the findings, the conclusion is that there's similar learning between open textbooks and commercial textbooks. Another important issue when discussing the impact of open textbooks is course withdrawal rate. It's possible that an open textbook could relate to course withdrawal rate. That's something that I found in my own study where I compared my own open textbook adoption. I found a significant reduction in students who withdrew from the course. 20% of students say that they have withdrawn from a course because of the cost of the textbook. These withdrawals extend the time it takes for students to graduate, which is costly to both the students and the institutions. So there are a number of methodological issues that should be considered when thinking about open textbook studies. I've been trained in, that a randomized controlled field experiment is the gold standard in research. And the key element there is the random assignment, in that your groups are about the same. So for a college textbook study, you would imagine that when you're looking at student learning withdrawal rate, there's so many factors other than the textbook that are going to affect student learning. Such as the student's motivation, the amount of time they have for studying, the pedagogical quality of the instructor, the availability of support services, and so on. With random assignment, you could say that the groups are about the same. However, that's generally not feasible when we're doing research in the post-secondary setting. College students don't get randomly assigned, for the most part, to their course offerings, as they self-select. So nearly all of the research has been quasi-experimental, meaning that you're comparing naturally occurring groups. And this means that, one, you don't have random assignments, so you can't know for you can't be as confident that the groups are comparable, but also in a lot of these studies, important factors were not controlled for. Sometimes there were different instructors, one with the commercial textbook, one with the open textbook. Some studies included a measure of prior achievement of background knowledge, and some studies didn't, to be able to determine if the students may have had a difference because of how they started out. That matters. For example, in my study, I initially found a benefit for student learning for the open textbook, but then I looked at my students' high school GPA and found that the difference in high school GPA was about the same as the difference in grades. So really, the textbook probably didn't have any real effect. Another issue is assessment instruments vary. So when you have different tests being compared or different grading methods being compared, then you're not having an apples to apples comparison. These methodological issues are considered a limitation of open textbook research that have been critiqued by researchers who are interested in college teaching in general. So all of these issues point to a need for a meta-analysis, which is what I decided to do here. A meta-analysis is a quantitative aggregation of all the findings for a bunch of studies on the same topic. In order to find these studies, it's not like how we typically do literature reviews, where you would go into PsycInfo or ERIC or Google Scholar with your search terms and look through and see what the studies are. With this, you do a very thorough and unbiased and exhaustive search, which means you enter those terms into databases and search all of the findings, which it can be hundreds or thousands of citations to screen. Then you're checking the references from the qualified studies and everything that's cited that. But the idea is that you're not cherry picking your findings. You're really trying to find what the true effect is. And this can be helpful to get that overall picture of the forest for the trees, but also you can look at how those studies may have differed in certain factors, such as the methodological issues I mentioned before, and see if that identifies a reason for why there's variation in study findings. So that brings me to my research questions. What's the efficacy in terms of learning outcome of open textbooks compared to commercial textbooks? What are the differences in withdrawal rates for courses with open source textbooks compared to commercial textbooks? And what were the moderators? And I specifically looked at the methodological issues I mentioned earlier with study design of the findings for these research questions. So there's a lot going on in this figure, but this goes through how I found these studies. So at the top, I first did database searching. I looked through PsycInfo, ERIC, Scopus, and I'm sure I'm forgetting one. Oh, Directory of Open Access Online Journals. And then after the duplicates were removed, we then screened all those abstracts. Then the full texts of the remaining studies were assessed. And then many of those were excluded because they didn't meet the inclusion criteria. We found that there were 22 reports. We also got recommendations from the authors of those reports. We didn't find anything looking at the reference list, but we did find a study looking at who had cited those studies. And then searched presentations from Open Education 2018. And the Open Education group that I'm a member of has a website that compiles studies on open educational resources. So then I calculated the effect sizes comparing groups. Basically, you take the mean of one group. So for example, the average grades for students getting a commercial textbook, and subtract the mean of the other group and the grades of students who got open textbooks, and divide it by the standard deviation, which means how much variation there is. And I used Hedges G because it corrects for small sample size. This is particularly important with this kind of research because some of these studies had tens of thousands of students in them, and some of the studies would have maybe 20 students. So you didn't want the findings from a study with 20 students given the same amount of weight as the findings from a study with 10,000. What I found based on 22 studies with over 100,000 participants is that there was no reliable difference. I won't go into all of the statistical details there. I have them up in case there are fellow stats wonks out there who are curious, but you can see that the average effect of the difference was 0.01, so it was almost 1, and that finding was not reliable. I also looked to see, did I have enough participants to find an effect? If there was did I have enough power? And the power analysis indicated that I by far had enough power to detect an effect, if there was at least a small effect. I also looked at the equivalence to 0. Almost 0 and 0 are different things. What this is a test is to see, are these measures equivalent? Whereas the other test was to look at, are they different? In this test, where I'm looking for statistical equivalence, if those horizontal lines intersected with those vertical dotted lines, then there would be a non-zero difference. You could not say they're equivalent. As you can see from this graph, the horizontal lines are within the vertical lines. They do not intersect, indicating that open textbooks and commercial textbooks are equivalent on learning outcomes. So how about moderators? Moderators would be factors that would change the findings. So in this case, the independent variable is the type of textbook, and the dependent variables is the student learning performance, usually the grades. So I looked to see if I grouped studies based on whether or not the same instructor was compared, whether or not they had the same assessment of learning, and whether or not they incorporated prior student achievement. And the effect or lack of effect between open and commercial textbooks and student learning did not change based on any of these. So it did not appear that there were methodological reasons to be concerned about the findings. That it seems like it's a pretty robust finding. I also looked at publication bias. With publication bias, one thing that you're concerned about with a meta-analysis is that people tend to be more inclined to publish things, and publishers are more likely to accept things if you have a reliably statistically significant difference, or if your findings are considered interesting. This is a big shortcoming in research because we have what's called the file drawer effect, where findings that don't really fit just get shoved away because it's hard to publish them, or because a research may not want to publish them because they feel like it would, make the prior work look bad or make it look like they had done something wrong. Anyway, the way this works is there's a funnel plot that looks at the standard error. If the two sides of that horizontal line in the triangle were asymmetrical, and if there was more spread on the bottom with the smaller studies than on the top with the bigger studies, then that would be a sign of publication bias. But as you can see here, it's pretty symmetrical on both sides of that line in the middle of the triangle. And there was a statistical test that indicated that did seem to be a lack of publication bias. Also, the spread of how far out the individual study's effect is from the overall aggregate effect doesn't seem to vary by the size of the study. So you don't see the smaller studies with larger standard errors more spread out on the bottom. They seem to be clustered pretty close to the mean. All right, on to withdrawal rate. I calculated the odds ratio. So in this case, the predictor was it an open textbook, a commercial textbook? The outcome was, did the student withdraw from the course or the student not withdraw from the course? An odds ratio less than 1 means a student was less likely to withdraw from a course with an open textbook than a commercial textbook. Here I found a rather robust effect. I found that students were 29% less likely to withdraw from a course if there's an open source textbook than if there's a commercial textbook. This is based on 11 studies with 78,593 students. That's a lot of students, but I will admit that's not really considered a huge number of studies. That's really, 10 is considered the bare minimum for meta-analysis. So that is, one grain of salt to take with this finding. However, it is highly reliable based on the p-value. Because of the number of studies involved, moderator tests weren't appropriate because there needs to be a certain number in each category to conduct those tests, so I wasn't able to. And then as far as publication bias, only half of the findings on withdrawal rate were published. The other half I got by contacting the authors who had published on learning efficacy, and I said, hey, do you happen to have your withdrawal rate information? And then they provided it to me. So those studies weren't published, so no publication bias. Out of curiosity, I did group them separately and to see if there was a difference between the findings that were published and the findings that authors gave me upon request, and there wasn't. They were very similar. So discussion. Bottom line, there is no difference in learning efficacy between open and commercial textbooks. This shows that a book that costs $300 does not appear to help a student learn any more than a book they can access for $0. That said, this does raise a bit of concern of why didn't we see a benefit of open textbooks? Everybody's able to have a book. We have that access. You think that that could help the students out? Well, there's some reasons for that. One, I'd like to point out that there was a lot of variability. If you look at this funnel plot, you can see that those studies, those circles represent individual studies, and there's a lot of spread. They're not all clustered tightly together. So that might be due to the access hypothesis. That access hypothesis is that open textbooks are going to primarily benefit a small group of students. Those are students who need the textbook to do well in the class and cannot afford a commercial textbook. So that population of student varies from course to institution to, one semester to the next. But this would hypothetically mean that there were subgroups within this data set that did benefit from the open textbook, but it wasn't a large enough number of them where we saw it helping the overall student body. One study by Colvard found that there were subgroups of students that had benefits. Colvard specifically looked at students who were Pell Grant recipients and therefore likely lower income than their peers, and found that students who received Pell Grants had more of a benefit from an open textbook than their peers. Another reason why we might not see a difference is because instructors may vary their pedagogy based on textbook selection. So anecdotally, I know of instructors who know the book is really expensive and will tell their students, hey, if you come to class and take good notes, you don't need to buy that book. Or we'll tell students just like the book is available as a reference, but you don't actually need it. But then for an open textbook, they might have it used more in the course because they know their students have it. So with those different approaches, you could see the importance of having a textbook being different based on different pedagogical approaches. One thing I'd like to point out that I get asked quite a bit when I present these findings about OER and about open textbooks is, hey, I've heard that reading from screens is worse than reading from paper. And yeah, based on systematic reviews and meta-analyses, reading performance is better from paper than screens. And it is true that students almost always read an open textbook from a screen. I actually just did a study, and I think I had 3 students out of 174 in the study sample who indicated that they either ordered a bound copy or printed out their copy of the textbook. Overwhelmingly, students exclusively read their open textbook from screens. So shouldn't there be a problem? I'm actually well acquainted with this research. I am the author of one of those meta-analyses. And in this work, I did find that, yes, there is a small benefit of reading from paper compared to screens, especially for expository nonfiction text, which is primarily what college students are going to be reading in their textbooks. So, why the disconnect? Well, one reason is the context is massively different. In the reading medium studies that I reviewed and meta-analyzed, those were controlled lab experiments or other controlled environments. They had students who were entirely learning from the book. These were not real students getting real grades. These were research participants getting bonus points or getting a $10 gift card for agreeing to be in a study. Almost always their performance on what they learned after reading the text did not affect their grade. There are so many other student factors that are going to be so much more important than reading medium. In those reading medium studies, the students only had the book to learn from. In a college classroom, let's hope that they have other resources. They should be, learning primarily from their instructor and their peers, not learning primarily from their book, although the books are obviously a very important and useful learning tool. Other student factors such as having motivation, institutional knowledge, and just knowing the culture of the institution can help students have a better idea of how to succeed at an institution. The amount of time that they can dedicate to study, those are all going to have much bigger impacts on learning than reading medium. So that said, the studies on open textbook tend to be done, are almost always done in real world context. I did do an experimental comparison where it was a randomized controlled study where participants, signed up to get extra credit in their psychology course, showed up, read an excerpt from a textbook, and then took a test on it. And we, assessed to see if they had prior knowledge before and also controlled for their reading skill. And we found no difference between reading from open and commercial excerpts. It should also be pointed out that commercial publishers are really pushing the online e-textbook versions of their books. One reason for that is they want instructors to use their particular platforms, because then students have to buy an access code. They can't share a book. They can't use an older edition book. They can't sell their book. It's something where publishers can have more of a assurance that students have to pay. And I do want to reiterate that open textbooks can be read from paper. And I do tell my students that if they prefer to read from paper, they probably should. That if it's something that they need to focus on and they prefer to read from paper, they'll probably learn better from it if they print it out. And I also give students directions on how to print out their textbooks. Okay, withdrawal rate, we did see a notable difference. Fewer students withdrew when open textbooks are used. It should be noted that the #1 reason why students withdraw from a course is to avoid a bad grade or because they anticipate failing. The cost of the textbook is usually not at the top of the list. That said, if you're a student and you're in a class and you know you're behind and you know you can immediately go and download the textbook and use that to catch up, versus you have to, obtain the commercial textbook, so you have to pay for it. You may need to wait for shipping if you're getting a hard copy. Those small factors in ease of access and that big factor in terms of cost would logically contribute to a student's decision to remain in the course. One question I've gotten about this is that fewer students are withdrawing with open textbook. Does that mean that lower performing students are the ones that stay in? That may be possible, but we didn't see a difference in learning performance between open and commercial textbooks. So I doubt that there was something where the open textbook was keeping students in that maybe should have withdrawn because they were going to fail. So I'm definitely on the side of keeping students in the courses as whenever possible. All right, future area of inquiry. Realize I'm talking to a higher ed audience, but I think a big path forward for not just open textbooks, but OER in general is K-12 research. And K-12 scenarios, the students aren't the immediate funders of materials. My daughter's school doesn't send me home a bill for her textbook and learning materials, but I do get a property tax bill that goes to those things. So looking at how these tools can be used in K-12 is a really important path going forward. I was only able to locate one study that had used K-12 that would have otherwise qualified in my meta-analysis. Another thing is a broader geographic scope. Every study in my meta-analysis except one was in the United States or Canada. OER use is global, so we need to have a better understanding of how this is working outside of North America. That and subgroup analysis. This goes back to the idea that there's some students who are going to benefit from an open textbook more than other students. Who are they and how can we help them? My personal future directions, this is what I have on tap, is to look at faculty motivation for adopting open educational resources. I am teaming up with a colleague who specializes in faculty motivation, and we are going to take an approach grounded in self-determination theory, which is a long-held theory in human motivation. The idea with self-determination theory is the more autonomy or freedom, competence, or your belief in your efficacy, and relatedness, which means your connectedness with other people you have, those all contribute to your desire to be self-determined and your motivation for doing things. Our intentions with this study would be to inform initiatives to support OER adoption. I'm sure we've all talked to colleagues or know people who, know about OER, could change. Maybe there's even incentive funding to help with adoption to pay for the time for course redevelopment, but are reluctant to change over to an OER. And to get an idea as to why. Is it because they lack a feeling of competence. Well, if that's it, then we know that interventions should do things like explain how to find OER. Here is the article. It is open access, so anyone with internet access may read it. You can go ahead and either scan that QR code reader or that link is also would also take you to the article. So I encourage you to look at my rather thorough and lengthy article in order to check into any questions you may have about the details, or ask me. Of course, you may feel free to ask me, as we'll have Q&A shortly. I also would like to take this opportunity to ask if anyone would be interested in collaborating with me on a study I'm doing. Like I said, my background is in reading comprehension, and along with my colleagues, we're looking to see how we can develop a reading test that doesn't just say whether or not a student struggles with reading, but would give actionable feedback as to why a student may struggle with reading. So this is something that students can either just take online at their convenience, or they can be assigned by an instructor and given it in class or in a assessment setting. As starting this fall, we'll have video feedback for students based on their pattern of incorrect responses. But for now, we're just looking for college students to take the test. There's more information about it at that URL. And please feel free to email me with any questions you may have. So I will stop there as far as my presentation and open it up to questions. See, is there a chat function too? Feel free to put any questions you may have in the chat. Sometimes that can work pretty nicely.
I'm fascinated by this idea that you have about, or this research that you've been doing about really thinking about the context of student success in the modality that they're reading, because in nursing, at least, my experience has been, and there's a lot of students that are like, I need the textbook. I have to have the textbook. And it's really interesting.
Oh, yeah, the whole digital native idea is students today, I mean, you know, they prefer paper overwhelmingly.
Yeah, and it's interesting though, because we've recently transitioned to the ebook adoption because it was saving them about half the price, and then they get all the extra materials, which you know, as you said, publishers are really pushing, because then they can have these cycles of funding that are pretty much unending. And there's not different publishers used, you have one publisher, right? But for us, for right now, until there's more materials specific to nursing developed that are open, that aren't just pieces of content and full text, which I know the OpenRN project, they're working on that, but it's interesting because students always say they want the textbook, but then now that we've gone to this ebook platform, I'm not seeing a big change or big difference in success rates. But it does make me curious about how much reading is being done in either, you know, either mode, like how much is really happening, because I love the concept that the learning is not just about reading the textbook, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's the classroom, it's the conversations, it's the discussions, it's the interactions, right?
Yes, and I can tell you there's, you know, research that's been done on how much independently reading the textbook relates to your grade in the course. And there's not a ton of studies on this, but generally what you see is students who don't read a lot, who don't read at all, do poorly. And then as they read more, their grades improve. But then you have the students who are reading a lot also doing poorly. And it's usually a case that they're just not getting it, and they're using ineffective, time-consuming strategies. And so even though they're reading a lot, it's not helping their grade.
Yeah, it's almost like you need to do some kind of guidance so that there's intent, right? So you're really either tying the materials and the content, whatever it be, to the conversations, so that there's that tie where there's an opportunity to ask questions and dig deeper and more actively look at how the materials apply, instead of this separation of here's the book to do the assigned reading and here's the class. And I think that goes back to a lot of what, the active learning approaches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a critique I've gotten with this line of research in general, is that textbooks are passé and passive learning and traditional, and we should be moving beyond them, like stop researching textbooks. And I disagree. I think textbooks are really helpful learning tools. I think that they can be used in active learning context effectively. I don't think the specific material is what makes a course active or passive. It's how that material is used.
Right. And hopefully, I think we've had some student feedback sometimes too when we've asked questions about textbook affordability on our campus particularly, and surprisingly some students had said, well, I don't want to buy the book if it's not going to be used.
Right.
And I think there just has to be a really clear context to the faculty may think that they are using it because they're assigning the reading and that they're applying it, and in their mind they're using it. But if the student doesn't see that connection intentionally, right, if they don't make that connection, and this could apply with open too, because I think sometimes students may not know that those are the resources that are the textbook for any particular course.
Yeah,
So
I did have a
connection.
student once who was doing poorly on the quizzes come and talk to me, and she's like, I don't know what it is. I come to class, I take good notes, but I can't figure out the answer to these questions. I said, well, a lot of times they're to encourage you. They're low stakes weekly quizzes you do at your own time. It's an incentive for reading. And I said, well, are you having difficulty understanding the book? And she's like, I thought we didn't have a book for this class. I'm like, yeah, we do. And once I showed her that, she's like, oh, and then her grades.
And then she finally did better on the quizzes, probably.
Yes.
So this kind of next step with your research in the fall is really digging into that idea of reading comprehension. Are you looking at all college students, all levels?
Okay, for the reading test, it's all college students. We are more interested in students who are first year or transfer students who are typically, considered more at risk of not continuing or more in transition. Also more interested in students who need study skills or reading support from the institution, but any college student, any undergraduate student is eligible to participate.
Okay, because I have some people in mind that I might be able to share it out with.
Oh, please do. Yeah.
I think it's a great approach.
Thanks. Yeah, that link takes you to a description of the study and then how the test works and any questions. So the PI is actually at Cal State Chico.
Oh, okay.
So in your system.
Another one of our partners, yeah. All right, I'll see if anybody else has questions as well, so I don't take over. All right. Oh, you have a question? Are you jumping in? Love to hear you.
Well, I'm watching myself on two different screens here. The benefit to having, hold on, let me turn that down so I can hear the TV. The benefit of actually having an actual textbook available, besides just the CI campus, do you think it could be applied to other colleges? Like the GCs in the area? This is so awkward.
Sorry, could you put your question in the chat? There's some feedback.
Hold on. Okay, cool. Question. So basically, like,
There you go.
you are using the whole program of the OpenCI concept to where on campus to have textbook available to anyone. Could it be applied to that of the junior colleges to kind of pump them up a little bit, say like transfer day celebration, and then go from there? Like, couldn't, like, just as an awareness kind of spread or anything like that?
As far as, I mean, the studies in this report were throughout the United States and Canada. Some were 2 years, some were 4 year. As far as awareness, I guess I'm not quite understanding. I'm not at Cal State.
I mean, just in general, like if it was to spread awareness as a better concept for saving up money, especially with any CSU, UC schools, or just in general.
As far as tactics to spread awareness about it?
Yeah, and to save a couple dollars.
Yes, yes. So I have to admit that PR is out of my wheelhouse. One of my motivations for the motivation study is to better inform how to get that awareness out and how to best share the message. Do we focus on the cost savings? Do we focus on, I mean, I didn't even go into the customizable features of open textbooks. I mean, that's a huge benefit for a lot of instructors and students, that they are a lot more flexible and you can edit them and you can change them and cut them and mix them, and you can't do those things with commercial textbooks. So I mean, that might be a feature that faculty might like. I know there are some, like larger groups that are looking at how to spread awareness to, or, thinking about long-term sustainability for getting things out. So, I haven't heard as much about how to get the message to students. I do know that some funding initiatives and some campus initiatives started out by student group initiatives, like the student Senate, or whatever the student governing body, went to the administration and said, why, OER exists. We're hearing about this being used at other institutions. Why aren't we using it here?
Okay, that solves my question.
Okay.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and I can jump in and say, on our campus, we have done some efforts just around the general bigger concepts of affordability and maintaining quality, and really trying to get more student input. And I think having student government involved in that voice, specific to our campus in case the students are interested. And we even have tabling going on today at noon, so that there's kind of more sharing out about, that faculty really are committed to looking at resources and trying, and in general, if there's questions, they can always talk to us or go to the website or try to learn more about it, and how to even just the basics as far as searching for no-cost courses, some of those basic instructions about where to look. Because if a student has a pathway that's already kind of strategically set for their major, then they may just go straight to registration and not even look for course options. And so that may be really valuable, especially when we're thinking about, even if they have a set path where they maybe only have one section option, but looking at other courses like your upper division GE courses, maybe there's options for no cost in those listings. And so really just trying to share out that voice and where they would go to, and if they want to have a voice, how they can share back. Like tomorrow we have a student panel planned, and so trying to get the student voice back across our campus also. And I think that's important for people to think about where that is, but maybe important to think about in some of the research you're doing too, is, why is there a preference whether it be for the online materials or a textbook. You know, for example, my students saying, you know, they have to have a textbook. Well, why do they feel that need? Is that because that's what their norm has been?
I actually have an ongoing study right now to look at why that difference may be, and I'm collecting data right now, and what I'm looking at is, you know, is it a, because a lot of times but students say they have a hard time focusing from a screen. So mind wandering is one thing I'm looking at, and the other thing is there's a hypothesis that the medium provides a context cue where a screen is for more like frivolous, light activities and paper is for serious study. So I'm looking at if different purposes for reading. So you're told like read this for fun versus read this because you have a test in 15 minutes. And how that affects things.
Well, and I think generationally that may change a bit. I love that you're doing that, and we'd love to have you share back your work when you're
sure.
But I think even generationally, because I think about my kids that are in grade school and middle school and how they're interacting sometimes through Chromebooks, sometimes with ebooks, and then sometimes with physical books. And so maybe that comfort of using the different modalities may, you know, kind of.
And I think it's also just having that association of using a screen for serious work as opposed to using a screen for social media or more lighter tasks. Because, for example, at one of the high schools in my hometown, they don't have paper textbooks anymore. Everyone has a Chromebook, and I know that's becoming more common. So given that, are we going to see that students are going to, you know, see screens as equally used for study or for leisure?
Right.
Stop having that contextual cue, because I started that meta-analysis on paper versus screen, assuming there'd be no difference, because based on my background in text comprehension, I couldn't think of a theoretical reason there would be a difference.
Right.
So I was shocked, to be honest.
Yeah, and I
was proven wrong. The funny thing is I get portrayed as like this anti-screen person when I'm one of those few people that prefers reading from a screen.
Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah, I'm that like 5% of the population my age.
Yeah, I always think of screen reading. I'm focused, but every thought I have, I feel like I have to hold myself back from opening another window to like feed that thought. And so that's something I know about myself that I think, you know, maybe just awareness too about, you know, how you work, how you learn, like what distracts you. Because I know that distracts me. And so I try not to open those windows when I want to be focused.
Yeah, when I was doing my stats homework in grad school, I would unplug my modem.
Yeah.
Because I had to use my computer, but if my modem was unplugged, and that was before smartphones were really a thing. So like if my modem was unplugged, social media was not accessible and my email was not accessible. So
those distractors just weren't there for you.
Exactly. So that was a workaround.
A way to turn the pings off. Great. Any other feedback or thoughts? Otherwise we may wrap up a few minutes early.
Oh, I did want to add, I am also, my current meta-analysis in process is on multitasking and reading. Speaking of those interruptions, yes.
Yeah, so please share back. I'd love to see what you do.
Yes. Right now we're in the abstract screening phase where we have 4,000 abstracts to screen. So right now I don't have any findings to share.
Yeah.
I can share, like, this is basically what I do for however long. I get an abstract to pop up.
Yeah. Great. So. All right. Well, we can't wait to hear more. And I so appreciate your time sharing with us.
Oh, thank you so much.
We are so grateful for giving us your time for Open Education Week. And I love seeing all your research and can't wait to hear more about what you're doing.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for
All right.
inviting me.
Any other thoughts or comments before we let her go?
Yeah, and please know I'll put my copy and paste my email and that flyer in the chat in case if anybody wants to access it, can shoot me an email with any questions that come up.